Well, good morning everybody. Bore da, croeso I cyfarfod plant a pobl ifanc yn Trefynwy. Good morning everybody. Welcome to the Children and Young People Scrutiny meeting in Monmouthshire this morning, but obviously on Teams. I'm Tudor Thomas. I'm Chair of Children and Young People. I won't be introducing everybody today. I will ask people when they make a point or ask a question to actually say who they are and what their role is. I now move to the agenda, and the first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. We've received apologies from County Councillor Joanne Watkins, who can't attend today. I'm not aware of any other apologies that have actually come in. Item 2, declaration of interest. We'll take this as and when. If you are involved, then obviously you have an interest, then please declare it in the meeting. Agenda item 3, the public open forum. I'm not aware of any member of the public who has asked to take part today. Before we go to item 4, can I ask, the normal etiquette today is that cameras are off and mics are off, other than presenters, and I'll be handing over to Will McLean in a minute, so that there is no sort of feedback, etc. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Will McLean, who is the Chief Officer for Children and Young People, and he's going to take us now through the report on the performance of the work of the Directorate over probably one of the most difficult years that any authority has seen. The report is probably different, and I know Will outline that. And as well, it came fairly late last night because Will had been tied up with other things, but we've had some time to look at it. But obviously we will be picking up now after Will has given us a cut through the report. So I'll hand over to Will. Diolch yn fawr. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, members of the committee. My name is Will McLean, as the Chair has said, and I'm the Chief Officer for Children and Young People in Monmouthshire. And it's I'm really pleased to be able to be here this morning to present this draft of my Chief Officer's report to the Select Committee. And I always think this is a really important staging post as I take this report on to full council in the future, because it gives you the opportunity to look and to comment on the areas which I think have been important in the last year, and it gives me that opportunity to reflect on those comments and make amendments and changes to the report following our conversation this morning. So if members are okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully I will work our way through the presentation then. So hopefully members are able to see now what's on the screen. I hope so. So I guess the first clue that something is different is on the front page this year, and ordinarily it's just a plain page, but I did think that these captures from our social media commentary during the year do show, I think, the journey that we've been on in 2020, 2021. And obviously starting on the left there with school closure, and on the right hand side, keeping our schools safe. And it has been, and I know unprecedented is a word which is used probably too frequently, but it really has been just a hugely different and an unprecedented year for all of our schools and the services that we offer to those schools to support them and to support all of our children and young people across the county. And the Chair mentioned in his introduction that this year's report is different to past year's reports, and I think quite scarily, I think this is my 5th Chief Officer's report that I've provided to Select and to full council. And I think the one point that I reflected upon was just how much of what I would normally report on, I'm unable to report on this year. The report is normally made up of a series of sections around things like outcomes at the end of key stages, GCSE results, A-level results, attendance, exclusions, and so on. Key totems of our education system that we see work through the year. But quite simply, because of the pandemic, very, very few of those things actually happened. So this year's report does look and feel different, but I hope it's still valuable for members nevertheless. So just in terms of what I intend to cover, I'll set out the purpose of the report, talk a little bit around an introduction. Then there's a section on Chief Officer's reflections, and you might have noticed, sorry, that they reflect the same sections as the Estin letter that I talked to this committee about last time you were together. It just seemed to be a good way to break up the activity of the past 12 months. I do want to touch on the work that's emerged around well-being. I will talk about student outcomes because that in its own right was a significant story and a significant development as the summer unwound last year. I'd like to introduce a new initiative that we're rolling out across all of our schools called A Compass for Life, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Schools' finances are really important for me to refer to today because of some changes that we've seen at year end and so on. There's quite significant implications for schools and for CYP itself about how we manage those going forward. And then the final section is really around our future focus. And I've tried to move us away a little bit this year from some of the structures that we've used in the past to a new structure for future planning, one that focuses on purpose, people, places and pedagogy. And then finally, I'll just bring the report to conclusions, and then obviously I'll be happy to take questions and observations from members of the committee. So just to touch on the purpose, I think much of this I probably talked about already. You know, we've had this incredible year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has had this huge impact on education right across the world, and Monmouthshire felt it as acutely as anywhere else. I've talked a little bit about what we're unable to report on. So some of the formal reporting around the end of key stage assessments are simply set aside by the Welsh Government. But I think even for Key Stage 4, which we'll come on to a little bit later, and Key Stage 5 in terms of A-levels, this year for 2020, it's actually, I think, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, it's almost impossible to compare those to any previous years. And, you know, the examination boards have recommended that we don't even use 2020 when comparing 2021 outcomes, those which will be achieved this summer. So I think that's a story in itself, and we'll touch on that later. And really just to draw members' attention to this kind of two aspects to the report this year, one which looks back over the year that's just gone, and one that looks forward to the future and how we rise hopefully to meet the challenges that the future will present. And then finally, just at the bottom then on slide 3, just to note really that the performance report on last year's areas of focus will be reported to Children and Young People's Committee in the coming half term. We are literally 20 days after the end of the administrative year, so we're still working through some of that data collection. It will be very different, and the likelihood of us achieving some of our targets and our goals that we set ourselves last year is unlikely. But nevertheless, I do think it's important that we do close that performance reporting loop and make sure that that we do that fully. So that will come to you again, as well as this report going on to full council, where you will have an opportunity to question me again, and of course other members of council will. So I guess in terms of the introduction, I think it's just really just trying to draw out the changes that we've seen. And I think, you know, in the second paragraph there, you know, we talk about whole new languages coming into education. You know, the notions around blended learning, around synchronous and asynchronous learning, words which, you know, when we were, you know, if we jump back to February last year, you know, when we were inspected, had little, you know, they meant something clearly, but they weren't part of the conversations that we were having day in, day out. The whole education delivery ecosystem has changed absolutely fundamentally. And I think just we've had to change in what we do as well. For a long time, our role and our focus was around accountability. It was about holding schools to account. It was about promoting good leadership. It was about making sure that our children did as well as they possibly could in school. And in that very, very simple announcement made on the 18th of March 2020, when it was announced that schools would close for what at that point in time was for a brought forward Easter holiday. Now, little did we know that it would mean that 2 terms in the next year were spent for children predominantly at home learning. We had to change our method of delivery to supporting our schools, to making sure that our schools were ready operationally to receive children, to making sure that they were ready to support their children in a completely different way, to making sure that their well-being resources were adequate to support children who were experiencing something that probably no other child in the last 50 years would have experienced. So huge, huge challenges and a big ask for all of the CYP services to literally change the way that they worked overnight as well. I think the one point, I think it's in the 4th paragraph, I think one lesson that was very clearly taught to us all was that to keep a school open, to keep a school safe, it requires a whole host of services, and all of those services are equally important and equally valuable. So absolutely, school leadership is critical, the teachers are critical, but equally, if you can't get the children to school, if the school isn't clean, if the children can't be fed in a safe and socially distanced way, then the school won't function. So I think it really brought out the fact that there's this kind of much broader engagement with our schools right across the authority that needed to happen to make sure that schools could continue. And I think that the other thing I would say, though, is that colleagues did react rapidly and effectively to the new challenges that they faced. But one of the things I'm really proud of is the way that they have kept going in terms of delivering some of the changes and thinking and the developments that were required in our post-Estin kind of inspection period. So members will be aware, obviously, that last February we had our core inspection by Estin. There were 4 recommendations around the critical ones around the ALN vision and around FSM support. They accelerated through the year, and officers brought to you at a couple of points in time emergent strategies and thinking about how they could be developed in the future. And I think to be able to continue to do that alongside the new work of the pandemic response, I think speaks really positively about the work. And then the final piece on that introduction just talks about what the future will look like, and I'll touch on that at length a little bit later. So one point which I did think was important to draw out was that we did have this rapid adaptation, and we're still on it today, of using Teams for our digital engagement with members. And I think that this slide, and I suspect there's probably some more aspects that I can add to this, does, I think, show that continued engagement with elected members throughout the pandemic, which I think is really important. And I hope that that members would reflect on the engagement that we've had as senior leaders, as chief officer, with the select committee, still taking through policy documents, but also those regular updates about what the return to school is, where are our schools at the moment, how are they coping, what are the pressures, and so on. And we've seen a broader range of officers present to you as a committee, I think, during the year. I think that's really positive. We've seen our partners in the EAS present as well. I think that's positive. And we'll continue to broaden the officer cadre that come to present to this body and the range of subjects that are presented to you as well as the year progresses now. I think it'll be really important because we'll be looking to learn what have been the consequences and the outcomes of the pandemic as we go forward. And I think just on that point, I think one of the things which I was very cautious of, and I hope I've hit it at the right kind of tone through the document, is a sense that we are coming to the end of a phase of the pandemic, but I'm clearly not going to make any grand statements that the pandemic is over. I think our schools know very clearly that they are still working in a very different environment. I think the operational guidance continually updated and offered by the Welsh Government means that our schools are working differently. But I do think there is a sense that in just having all of your pupils back actually makes it feel like a much more normal environment for learning across Monmouthshire. So this is a quick just update, these next couple of slides really about where we are, what our kind of framework is in Monmouthshire. So you'll see there that the numbers of pupils we have, 6,214 at primary age, just under 5,000 of secondary age pupils, that we have 85 children in out-of-county special schools, and we currently have 14 children in our pupil referral unit. Then you'll see our school estate, so 30 primary schools, our 4 secondary schools, our 12 maintained nurseries, they're almost always linked into our primaries, and 25 non-maintained settings, and our PRU. And obviously, in difference to last year, members will be aware, obviously, the significant work and governance changes that went around the closure of Mountain House, and that took place at that point in the pandemic. And I think just to recognise the work and the commitment that those staff showed to their learners right up until the end of their time at school. You'll also see at the final bullet point there the number of staff that work in the CYP Directorate, 57.2 full-time equivalent, but also the 1,500 staff who work across our schools. So that's, in broad terms, the shape of the services which we're talking about in schools and in CYP. The next 2 slides are blank, because this work can't be undertaken until the PLASC audit has been done. That PLASC date, the census date, is actually today. So by the time this is reported into full council, I'll be able to show you the full profile of our age range of our pupils, their male and female split. And I'll also be able to show you that full profile of our additional learning need population, because I know that's been helpful in discussions in the past. We'll now move on to the section of the report which are around my reflections on 2020-2021. And I think I'll start this, if I can, slightly in the year before, actually, that very, very late March development that we had around, an announcement that schools were closed, followed by a very, very swift second announcement that there was an expectation that local authorities would provide childcare, and it was childcare at that early stage, for children of critical workers and for vulnerable learners. I think it must have been on, Sunday the 22nd, and we had a very early Teams call with a group of head teachers on the Sunday evening to discuss what Monday morning would look like in the 9 schools at that stage who had volunteered to be the hubs across Monmouthshire. And I think that really kind of says it all, actually, with a country that was about to go into a national lockdown, school leaders, CYP staff were working together to put together a registration process, identifying online where people wanted to go to a childcare hub, making sure that attendance lists were captured, making sure that safeguarding regulations were in place, making sure that staff were attending the right hubs. It was a huge effort, literally stood up in a couple of days. And I think to be able to maintain that provision from the end of March all the way through to the end of June was a huge effort by our schools and by our CYP staff. And I think that really kind of captures that initial kind of urgent response to the pandemic. I spent a lot of time in the hubs during that period of time, and it was so positive to see the way that the clusters of schools came together. So ordinarily, probably about 3 or 4 schools would work across one hub. They would share the leadership responsibility, they would share the staffing responsibilities. Our catering staff were amazing. They would be in providing food for everybody who was in the childcare setting. Our cleaners were kind of working extra hours, in essence, just kind of perpetually cleaning, making sure surfaces were wiped down. It was a huge response, and particularly in the north of the county, in and around Abergavenny, where obviously we had at that time a district general hospital. There was really significant take-up of the places in Abergavenny, the same in the south of the county. It was a huge effort. And I think when you look back, and it's strange because the year has been, so much has happened actually, that actually when you look back, it was a really kind of important exercise for me to write this report, because you did really prompt you about what was done and the extra mile that people went to. So you had teaching staff then operating 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. every single day. We were offering weekend coverage. If people wanted weekend coverage, but there wasn't sufficient for a hub to be open, then colleagues in early years, so Sue Hall, would be working with childminders to make sure that we could make that available for people. Everybody was just working flat out to make sure that that would be effective. The announcement by the Welsh Government then, as we came towards the end of May, that children would be able to return to school for a period of what was termed then checking, catch up and prepare, actually presented some significant challenges for us. The Minister made an announcement that she wanted children to go back for a 4-week period, and that extra week would eat a week into their summer holidays. But schools and providers who did that would be rewarded, or would have a compensatory additional week at the October half term. And we worked hard with our schools to understand the current provision that we were offering to children of critical workers and vulnerable learners, what the impact of that was, because you're only allowed 30% of your children on the school site to make sure that you could enable social distancing. And in the end, we determined that actually we had a minimum expectation of all children being offered at least 1 day in school a week for those 3 weeks. If we'd done an extra week, then it meant that children over a 4-week period would have 4 days. But they would then lose 5 days of learning in the autumn term by virtue of having 1 extra day in the summer term. And that didn't feel like a fair return to us. So working with our school leaders and with our union colleagues, we determined that we would hold to the traditional end of term date. And we offered those 3 weeks of checking, catch up and prepare. And I think it was a really valuable exercise, because it meant that our staff and our children did go back to school. They did understand what it felt like to be back in that setting, and that laid, I think, important foundations for the return to school in September 2020. I think the other bits and pieces I think I just kind of really capture on that slide, just around, and I think I've probably touched on this already really, but just in terms of the collaboration that took place across our own organisation, across the different professional services within CYP, across our school leaders, and in terms of our partners, I think was fantastic. So I think that sense of collaboration really came out very, very clearly. And again, referring to the letter that we discussed last time, I think it's very fair. I think Estin's opening comment, the authority's crisis management has been agile and responsive. Building on effective positive relations, senior officers sought effective communications and clear expectations. And I think those were probably the kind of the main tenets of how I tried to lead our teams through this process, was just being very clear about what we expected, recognising that there would be differences across our schools, but communicating things very, very clearly and effectively to the schools throughout that period of time. And you can just see highlighted in that green box on that slide that on Wednesday, the 24th of June, we had 401 children in our school hubs. And, you know, we were providing that number frequently up and around those kind of hundreds of children in our schools. And I think it was a really, really significant effort by all involved. I think this slide, I think, really focuses on this new approach to learning. And I think one of the things which happened, I talked a little bit earlier, didn't I, about blended learning and synchronous and asynchronous. Suddenly, schools had to change the way in which they provided learning opportunities for their children. And I think this was hugely important in terms of how they thought about their pedagogy, about their curriculum, how they reflected about what children had access at home to technology, to support from their parents. And I think the whole system has worked through this. I think quite clearly it would be fair to say, that there was differentiated practice in the early days as schools got ready for it and reacted to that closure announcement. And one of the other interesting things that I think both we in Monmouthshire and colleagues in the AS and actually colleagues across Wales have observed is that actually some schools who you would have said were really strong schools, provided excellent teaching and learning in the classroom, took a little bit longer to adapt to the new world of blended learning, whereby some of the schools who perhaps we might have had some concerns about in terms of some of the teaching and learning adapted to it very, very quickly and have really, really kind of risen to the challenge. So this was a really interesting period of time. There's quite a lot on this slide about the IT challenge, and that's something which members I know have been very interested in terms of the number of devices, how we were able to support children access them. Schools have provided a huge number of devices to learners. In the last year, we've procured over 3,000 Chromebooks and other devices to replenish school stocks and to be lent back out to children again. I think we've lent out 200 MiFi units, which provide cost-free broadband connectivity for families. We've repurposed, I think, nearly 400 devices, which were old laptops, which we could convert then into a Chromebook, a simplified device. And we've, working with our partners in the EAS, provided a huge amount of specific professional learning to enhance their ability. And I think on the right-hand side of the screen is a screenshot from I thought it was an excellent member seminar that was led by 8 of our schools, 4 secondary schools and 4 primary schools, to talk to you, to members directly about blended learning, because I know that it was an area of such concern. It was a whole new pedagogical approach. It was something whereby all of a sudden children were learning at home. Parents could see what was being done. Parents talked to parents. They could comparing schools. Concerns were being raised. But I think that kind of direct conversation with you as members from our schools, I think really did give a sense of the rapid adaptation that our schools undertook to make sure that our children really did access some very high quality education in that year. And I think that approach of that direct conversation with you as members was then taken forward by all of the authorities in South East Wales. So I think when Monmouthshire went first, I think others have followed since. The next slide is around how we supported schools. So we've talked a little bit about some of the direct work we did in terms of understanding the school's needs and so on. So I don't want to kind of just completely rerun some of those things. But I do think that our communication was really, really important. I think that our ability to deploy teams in a new way, I think was a significant benefit. So our colleagues in services such as the Education Welfare Service, who ordinarily are the people who chase up attendance matters, making sure that children can access school and the home is supportive and so on, really enhanced that well-being support. And they were on the phone, they were calling, making sure that people were okay if they weren't attending school and we thought they should be, immediately changing their delivery model to support that. And I think the other team that I think I just draw attention to was our education psychology service, and Moana and Lucy have presented to you in the last year the work they were doing, but their work suddenly took on this significant focus around well-being and working with our schools, providing additional training and support for our schools about how they could support our young learners. One of the real challenges was that, one of the great joys of schools is that they are with the children day in, day out. And suddenly a school's ability to have that eyes-on support, to notice the small things in our children which indicate that they might not be feeling as well as they normally do, had been diminished. So actually working with our schools to actually enhance some of their approaches to wellbeing was really important, and wellbeing is a message that's repeated throughout this report. We've talked a little bit about how we supported schools, but also I think it's important to recognise, as we do in this section, that school leaders themselves would be feeling significant pressure in this period of time. And one of the things we did to support our school leaders was just to provide some resource that wasn't counselling, that didn't trigger formal routes or anything, but we did recruit a very, very experienced former head teacher, almost just to act as a kind of somebody who'd been at the end of a phone. So when those challenges presented, as they did for all schools throughout the year, there was somebody who they could just talk to, just talk through their ideas, either just to let off steam or kind of have a suggestion about how they were going to tackle someone, and that person would be able just to be there just as a sounding board, really. And that was really well received by our schools in terms of how we did that and took that forward. Also talked about is just trying and take away weight off the schools in this very, very challenging time, just to let them really kind of get on with the most important thing, which was actually looking after their children and providing that education. So lots of work behind the scenes in supporting them with their risk assessments, interpreting the often changing operational guidance, it would be fair to say, from Welsh Government. So we were really trying to make sure that we were coming up with all of the support we could do. On the right hand side is an example of that. On the right hand side, you can see there the units and the numbers of items we've issued to the schools throughout the pandemic period. In terms of the PPE. PPE was one of those areas which rapidly gained huge attention, but you can just see there in terms of the numbers of masks, nearly 30,000 masks, litres and litres and litres of hand sanitizers, of sprays to wipe down surfaces. There was a huge amount of work being led there by colleagues in the Enterprise Directorate to both procure, source and deliver those out to schools in that period of time. And I guess one of the other things is that some of the more potentially mundane work continued. So the Welsh Government continued to allocate out grants. In fact, actually, it's been a feature this year, the size and the frequency of the grants that have been issued to schools. And we worked with schools in a very kind of, I think, sensitive way to make sure that we understood where they were spending their money, but equally at the same time that we weren't being kind of overly burdensome in terms of expecting records, over the top plans or anything. We just wanted to find the right balance for schools to make sure we understood, particularly around the Recruit, Recover, Raise Standards grant, we understood what was being spent, we understood their expected impact, but we weren't being kind of too prosaic in terms of actually demanding written reports back to us very frequently. So I'll touch now on how we supported our vulnerable learners. And again, this has been an area of significant interest for members across the council throughout the pandemic. There has been a huge amount of work done. And I think immediately we moved to a position whereby we had a very, very clear understanding with our schools that if any school leader or any teacher or any social services colleagues or CYP colleague felt that a child would be safer in school than being at home, then that child would automatically be allocated a place in school. And that was something that the schools responded to immediately and very positively. We did eventually kind of formulate that into I think 7 different categories of learners, but it included all of our children who've got additional learning needs. And right from the start, our SNRB bases were open, so all of the children were able to attend their SNRBs if they had that level of need, but also at the same time other vulnerable learners were supported in school. And you can see on the right hand side the different hubs down the left hand side the numbers of additional vulnerable learners who were identified, who had provision secured, and then the numbers that were taken up. So you can see there that 68% of all of our vulnerable learners took up that provision. Some didn't. Some quite often, it's particularly those families with children with complex needs, physical, medical needs and so on, just decided actually that they would rather have their children at home, that they felt at that kind of point in the pandemic it was safer for those children to be at home. So I think that was really important, that we were able to secure provision for all of those learners. And then just in the box at the right hand side there, and I will, this is one of the pieces, as I said, in terms of the drafting of this report, I will clarify this in terms of past trends, but in terms of the movement there, you can see a significant uplift of nearly 300 children in terms of additional children who became eligible for free school meals during the year. At the beginning, we were providing free school meals to children in school, and we operated a grab and go system, so children should come to school, pick up a lunch and take that home, and so on. However, it quickly became apparent that that was not a perfect solution in terms of social distancing, accessing to schools, making sure that different entrances and so on were being used. So we took the decision to move to direct payments to families, and you can see there that we've made 55,000 payments through the pandemic to parents for free school meal values, to a total value of £1.2 million. So that's obviously been supported by the Welsh Government, but I do think that that shows the kind of adaptation again and the response to a different way of providing services that we've learned through the year, and a significant amount of money going to families who did need that support through the year. And then the final section I think I just wanted to touch on was around how we've worked with partners, and I think that this is has been hugely positive from my perspective. Our relationships with schools, I think, have been improved. I think we've got better understanding of what our colleagues across Monmouthshire do now. We've worked really effectively with Welsh Government and with colleagues across the region. So the region we refer to as SWC, South East Wales Consortia area. We've met weekly well, actually, I think at the start of the pandemic, we were meeting daily with Welsh Government colleagues, but for every single week of the pandemic, the 5 directors have met. We've always tried to ensure, wherever we can, a consistent approach to the various challenges that were coming across to us from changes in government guidance and so on. And we've worked really hard to make sure that there was consensus across the five areas. We've also worked very closely with the Nair Bevan, and obviously, of course, the EAS. And I think that one of the things is noted just at the bottom of the left-hand side of slide 13. The pandemic really clarified the differing roles and place of local authorities and the EAS. And I think in a strange way, that was a really positive development. I think the schools had real clarity about who they were going to talk to about the different aspects, about the safety, about reopening, about expectations. It was always going to be talking to the local authority. In terms of how to some of the pedagogical changes, some of the differing approaches to blended and remote learning, it was the EAS. And I think for all of us, that clarity really helped in terms of how we've gone through the year, because the last thing you need are agencies producing duplicates or potentially the greatest risk, I guess, kind of opposing pieces of guidance about how things should be done. But there was absolute clarity. You can also see some comments on the right-hand side of that slide 13, where colleagues have reflected how this change in technological interaction through Teams actually really progressed and helped relationships with the Nair Bevan and the way that our ALN colleagues work with their colleagues in therapies and so on. So through this kind of terrible year, we have seen some innovation and we have seen some benefits to that. But overall, I think the way that we've worked with our partners has been very strong, and I think was one of the things which really guided us throughout the response to the pandemic. just want to, I've drawn this one out specifically because I think it is important, and this is an enhanced focus on well-being. Now, I think one of the things, I think once I'd drafted this report, I was hopeful of the fact that that it wouldn't seem as though this was something new, that this was something which schools weren't aware of or we weren't aware of, that well-being has always been important. And that clearly is the case. But I think that the pandemic really sharpened the focus on it, because all of a sudden we were hearing reports from the Children's Commissioner and other bodies about how young people were feeling. We were understanding that people were feeling isolated. I mean, these are, you know, when we look back about the year that's just passed, I think the steps that society took to contain the virus were hugely significant. The idea that you would stay in your home and not travel, not mix with other people, particularly for young people whose socialization is such a key part of growing up, was just unheard of. So actually, there's a new level to understanding well-being, which might have exacerbated some of the challenges that existed prior to March 2020. But it really became a real focus, and I think it was just worth drawing out some of the key tenets of that work. The work that our wellbeing group does to look at kind of some of the key data points, such as the School Health Research Network, the work that our EPS do, working with our schools. Our engagement with schools throughout the year has predominantly focused on the well-being of the school leader, the well-being of the staff, and how equipped they are to support the well-being of the children in their school. So there's been a significant shift in the dynamic around that. And I think that's echoed at a national level as well. And you can see that in 2021, Welsh Government's published its new approach to embedding a whole school approach to emotional and mental well-being in schools. We're very fortunate in that one of our own team is the regional implementation lead, that's Emma Taylor, and we can expect to see that develop significantly in the coming period of time. And it's another area where the government continues to fund significantly through grant-based work. And we've also seen the emergence of enhanced and accelerated training by our own teams, such as the educational psychologists. And there's one noted just there at the bottom on the right-hand side of slide 14, the emotionally based school avoidance work. So we've had, prior to the pandemic, a small group of learners who were, I think the language is around kind of school phobic, simply didn't want to attend school. That had an impact disproportionately on some cohorts, notably girls at secondary age. So this work is working across multi-agencies to work with those individuals who do have kind of school avoidance tendencies, which are rooted in emotion, and actually working with them to make sure that they can come back to school and they feel better and they're able to access the learning that we want them to. We'll come on now to, I guess, one of the rare bits of quantitative reflection on the year, some of this text is lifted from, on this slide, is lifted from the EAS report that came in front of this committee. And you can see that you know, all data collections have been cancelled for the summer 2020. And we saw this kind of development through March and July and then finally August as the government changed its policy position. And I think I was just drawing, you know, out into attention that final paragraph in red. It was really difficult, I think, for everybody, and I'm sure everybody will remember the furore over the algorithm, over centre assessed grades, and then finally the best of both. You know, it was a hugely challenging summer, and Wales set its path. England changed its path. Wales slightly adapted its path around things like AS and so on, which only it does. So there was all of these changes. And at the heart of all of that were learners who were planning on their next steps in their education or their life, to work, to training, to university. All of those things were predicated on what happened in those kind of late weeks of August in terms of examination outcomes. And I think Again, it's one of those things which at the height of it was hugely controversial and challenging, but now feels something in the distant past. We're now working with colleagues across our schools, colleagues within Qualifications Wales and the WJEC, to make sure that this summer's centre determined grades have more stability. And I know that our schools are doing regular briefings with their children and with their parents and families to make sure that they understand the process really clearly. But it is a huge burden for schools this year. But last year was chaotic in terms of the various announcements and so on. The next three tables are drawn from a report published by Qualifications Wales, and the link to that report is at the bottom of the slide. I think it's important for me to note, actually, I've put on each of these tables a green line and a red line. That's simply for your kind of ease to track across. The green line picks up the last outcome, which would be 2019, the last of the pale columns, and the red line picks up the final announced grade, which is the red line. It was pointed out to me, I shared this report with my colleagues in CYP, DMT and SLT yesterday. There's no value ascribed to green or red. I just want to be really clear about that, but they're simply to indicate the difference between the outcomes in 2019 and the final announced difference. So you can see here on the first graph, which is figure 7.2. So this is all of the UK GCSE grade C or 4. So in England, they use numbers rather than letters. And you can see there that in 2019, it was just above 60%, and it had risen in the 2020 revised, which is this kind of combination of centre assessed grades and standardised outcomes, to about 75%. So a significant uplift from the previous year. And on the right hand side, I think this is probably one of the starkest I've seen. You can see there, again, the final pale block is 2019 performance at A star for A level. So you see that, as I guess you'd expect, a very low number, about 9%. You can also see there, by the time the revised outcomes were issued, that number had risen to nearly 17%. So a really, really significant uplift. And this was through this process of, you know, as you go across to the right hand side, the slightly darker bar being the standardized, the grades determined through the algorithm, the next bar being the centre assessed grades, what teacher said students achieved, and then the final bar, the revised one, being the kind of the best of allocations, and that's seeing that increase. And again, on the final one, 5.2, national A level cumulative results, this is A star A, which largely repeats what you've just seen on the previous slide. Just a very, very significant upstep, and just shy of 45% of learners achieving an A or an A star in their A levels last year. So really significant changes. But again, there's that link to the Qualifications Wales document if people want to go back and look at that in more depth. Being really clear, the next two slides are about Monmouthshire's performance. So we've not named any schools. We're not using this in terms of any sense of accountability, but just in terms of making you aware of where our schools were. I think really positively, 3 of the 4 schools went through the kind of the threshold of 400 for the CAP point score. We saw right across English, Maths, Science and the Skills Challenge certificate, our average being in excess of 40, and 40 is a C grade in points equivalent. So that was very positive. Good percentages around the level 1 threshold, but then some really, and I guess looking back to the previous slides around the higher levels of performance, some really very good outcomes in terms of those children achieving 5 A star A's. But I think the next slide kind of draws out some concerns that remain, and it would be remiss of me not to recognise them even in the year we've just had, in terms of the performance for those learners who are eligible for free school meals. So you can see, again, the 4 schools anonymised, but you can see that there are significant variations and ranges, both in the CAP 9. You'll be able to see, obviously, that in mathematics, our numbers, nobody got to the average of 40 for their FSM learners. But on the right-hand side, you can see that in terms of 5 A-star A's, which is the kind of the benchmark for high attainment, you can see our EFSM pupils in one school did particularly well. So I'm not going to dwell on these because I don't think that's in the spirit of the way that we've dealt with performance in the last year. But I did think it was important just to share those with you, and they both of those tables have been in front of you previously as part of the AS's report. So this is onto a more kind of upbeat initiative that we've rolled out in our schools this year. This is the Compass for Life. One of the things which we've focused on is about how do we raise our attainment for our children who are eligible for free school meals. And part of that has to be around how do you raise their aspirations? How do you give those children the opportunity to think about what they could be, to actually really understand their potential and think about how they'll realise that potential. And we've been fortunate to work with an organisation called the Compass for Life Foundation. That's led by a gentleman by the name of Floyd Woodrow. Floyd has worked with us very closely at a senior leadership level within the authority. He's worked with our head teachers, our deputy head teachers, with the senior leadership team and the top 100 leaders across the organisation. And it works through a process with the children. And I was fortunate enough to see this at, I think, all of the schools actually that have been have enjoyed one of these sessions. Looking at the children, talking about their aspirations, really getting them to describe what they want to achieve, to really imagine what they could achieve, and to think about what it is that they're going to do to get there. So we've engaged Floyd to do this work with all of our year 5 and 6 learners. In the last year, we did it at our 4 schools with our highest levels of FSM, so Derryview, Thornwell, Overmono and Justo. The response was incredible. And I think if we had any of the 4 head teachers with us, they would talk to you about the energy and the excitement and the potential that was quite evident in all of those classrooms in each of those sessions that Floyd led. We're just putting in the diary the next 8 schools. There'll be another 8 in the next half term, and we're working through every single school in Monmouthshire experiencing this process. I think the part for me which I was most surprised at is that the session for the children who are 10 and 11 is almost identical to the session that we did as senior leaders in Monmouthshire. And the response from the children is immediate and infectious. And actually to sit in a room with children and to hear about what they want to do, what they want to be, they want to be vets, they want to work in hospitality, how they're going to do it, how many restaurants one little girl was telling me she was going to own. It was absolutely fantastic. But actually just to stop and listen and hear about them, hear about what they want to do and what drives those ambitions was really, really powerful. I was in Derryview and just understanding the impact that individuals have on children was utterly compelling. One little boy, I was sat on his table, and he said that he wanted to be a gardener and a carpenter. And I was just talking to him about why he wanted to do that. And the reason he wanted to do that was because that's what his grandfather did, and his grandfather had been the most consistent influence on his life. That's my words for it. His words were about his grandfather was the person who'd always been there with him. And I think that we just got to understand, what drives our children, what opportunities we can give them to see. And it's just a hugely, hugely valuable exercise. So I'm really excited about this process. We've also had the AS come to some of these sessions with us, and the AS have now taken Floyd on to do this work across some of their schools and across some of their governing bodies. So I think we're at the beginning of a really exciting intervention in terms of what we can do for our schools with the Compass for Life. The next slide, some slightly less exciting but equally important matters, picks up the impact of COVID on our finances. They are sharply contrasting, and I've made this point to our school's finance forum. I've made it to our head teachers, and I will continue to make it in the future. We have seen a really significant amount of money passported through to schools from the Welsh Government over the last year. Not only that, schools rightly, of course, and properly have been able to claim for aspects of school costs during the pandemic through the hardship fund from the Welsh Government. That impacted things like, as you can see on the left-hand side, the introduction that any pregnant teachers had to be away from school from week 28. Those additional costs were met by the hardship fund. Staff who had to self-isolate or to shield, their coverage costs were met by the hardship fund. Additional costs to maintain these bubbles or contact groups of 30 were all met by the hardship fund. So there was a huge amount of money pulled through the hardship fund, all meeting eligible and appropriate costs, of course. But then we've also had significant grant income in terms of the Recruit, Recover and Raise Standards grant. We've had money to support the local authorities, supporting schools in terms of the return to school to make sure it was as safe as it could be. And then right at the end of the academic year, literally in the last couple of weeks of May, we saw another couple of tranches of very significant revenue funding released to our schools. And I think the bottom paragraph there, month 9 forecast, shows schools to have a collective deficit balance of 166,000, with 12 schools in a deficit. That was a significant improvement from the start of the year, which I think was about 455,000 in a collective deficit. Our current projections, and we're working through year end at the moment, suggest that there could be a surplus across our schools in excess of £2.5 million. So that money coming through is really important, because this financial year is the year when the children will hopefully be back in school full time, and the money will have to be spent to support our learners, to make sure that the interventions that they need, the support that they need is there. But there is now a significant amount of money within our schools compared to where they have been previously. The change has been so great across Wales that Welsh Government actually wrote to local authorities to remind us that there are actually limits as to what schools should carry in terms of their surpluses. Secondary schools £100,000 and primary schools £50,000. There are now a significant number of our primary schools carrying surpluses significantly in advance of £50,000. So we will have to work very closely with our schools in the coming financial year to make sure that money is spent on the children, but to make sure it's spent to best effect. On the right hand side, you'll see a very different picture in terms of financial pressure. Month 9, you will see that is a challenging position for the authority. Largely an underspend in the ISB. That's due to some calculations around the potential rates for the new Monmouth Comprehensive and some additional grant support we had in for Teachers' Pay Awards. But I think that the key thing on the right hand side to take away is the continuing pressure of ALN support for learners. And really, for me, what this talks to in the coming year is a completely different dynamic in terms of money with regards to schools and the local authority. Throughout my tenure, which is probably now actually 5 years as chief officer, I've always sought to make sure we could support our schools as far as we possibly could. And often through the year, sums of money would become available that we could help to support some schools where they needed it. we're now in a very, very different situation. We're now in a situation whereby the centre is as tight as we can be. I'm hugely grateful for the work that Nikki Wellington and all of her colleagues have done to get us to the position at the start of the new administrative year to make sure that our budgets are balanced and so on. But now the schools have got a significant amount of money. So there will be a different type of conversation, I think, as we go forward in this academic year. I won't be telling the schools what I think they should spend the money on, but I think we will be having those conversations with them to make sure that it is valued, that they recognise that it is a surplus, so it can only be spent once, but that it has, if possible, a real resilience and a sustainability to that investment over time. I think that's hugely important. If I just carry on there, so this is now coming into the next section in terms of our my chief officer's report this year, and this is around the future direction. You know, how will Monmouthshire respond to the challenges of a post-pandemic world? So these are some statistics and so on that I took from a presentation that we've been shared by the Welsh Government. They are unbelievably stark and harsh and challenging statements. So if we'll just talk through them, I guess, very briefly. So the negative impacts of the pandemic could be 50% worse for disadvantaged children than they are from children who are advantaged, I guess, in terms of eligibility or in terms of their vulnerability. In terms of the Young Minds survey, 80% of respondents agreed that coronavirus had made their mental health worse, 41% saying it had made their mental health much worse. And there were feelings of anxiety, isolation, and a loss of coping mechanisms or a loss of motivation. And it's those kind of things, I think, which really bring out the significance around well-being. That sense of coping mechanisms, your opportunity to see your friends, to spend time with them, to engage in sport, kind of leisure activities, or just actually being at home, actually being demotivating. By autumn 20, there was significantly lower achievement in reading and maths compared to the 3 years previously. That's by the NFER study. That's significant in terms of particularly those children coming into school at the beginning of their schooling careers. 53% of learners questioned were struggling with learning at home. So that was a very early study, spring 2020. I would like to think that that position in Monmouthshire would have improved as the pandemic went forward. I think one of the big changes around learning from home that happened was that the initial advice was that teachers should not undertake at that time what we refer to as synchronous live lessons. That changed. There was some safeguarding issues put around it. So ordinarily you'll have 2 members of staff on a live lesson. And I think that really has changed the way in which children were interacting. But, you know, children have been back full time now for just a little bit, well, 3 weeks for primary school children and just over a week for secondary school children. So it will be interesting to hear feedback from our own school leaders as to where our children are and how their learning has been maintained over the past year. And then the final one, and I remember, you know, just being shocked at the starkness of this last bullet point. And this is from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. The long-term loss of earning in children in the UK had been estimated at £350 billion. And that was a consequential of that of £100 billion in tax revenue as well. That's one of their long-term extrapolations from what they've seen. Clearly, looking that far into the future is always a challenge. But if that were to actually come to fruition, then that's going to be a hugely significant gap for us to close and to really, really understand. I think the question mark on the other side is related to some of the first-hand feedback I've had from some of our school leaders since the children have been back in school. And certainly the message from some of them has been that actually for many of our children, the pandemic has been a period when they have been at home with their parents, and that's been really positive. And it's been a period of learning at home, which has actually engaged them positively. And I know, speaking to a couple of school leaders in the south of the county, they were saying how pleased they were with the way the children had returned to school, the progress that they'd made, and their readiness to learn back in school. So I think the immediacy of these studies on the left-hand side just needs to be tempered a little bit while we think through what the future might look like, and we actually get that first-hand feedback and understanding from our schools in the coming weeks and months. And certainly I think that's what this summer term has to be about. Clearly for some of our older learners, there are the processes around GCSEs and A-levels, but for many of our learners now, our schools will be gauging where they are in terms of their skill development and in terms of their knowledge and in terms of their ability to apply both of those things and actually make good progress. So in terms of how we in CYP are now going to focus our work, we're working through our business planning arrangements at the moment, and there are new corporate business plan arrangements which I think are hugely advantageous to us. But this framework is the one that we'll be following from now on, and it looks at our purpose, it looks at our people, it looks at our places, and it looks at our pedagogy. And I think it's a clear approach to how we plan for the future. So what I've done here, and again, just to say, I think for members that I suspect there will be some refinement in these slides before it goes to full council. I've identified the risks that I foresee with regards to purpose, people, place and pedagogy, but also the opportunities that we have. So sometimes they correlate perfectly and sometimes they're a little bit out of sync. So you can see there's 5 risks there, but there are 4 opportunities. So it's just we've been working through this. So I think with regards to our purpose, so at the moment our purpose is children and young people have the best possible start in life. I think we need to ask ourselves those questions now about whether that's an adequate and sufficient purpose. Is it detailed enough in terms of light of the COVID pandemic? A risk, quite clearly, as I've just referred to, we might not yet understand the impact of the pandemic fully. It might be worse than our understanding. It might be better than our understanding currently. And we need some time to work that through so we can really frame our interventions as purposefully as we can. If we do need a new purpose, then it will take time and it will take collective input to actually arrive at that purpose. So that will be a risk as well. Our purpose does need to reflect the changes to the education context in Wales and beyond. Reform is a huge part of the agenda in Wales at the moment. We're seeing curriculum reform, ALN reform, accountability reform, all of that is in play. Beyond that, the way that our children and young people think about things such as higher education, the way that higher education works and is its model sustainable into the future, will all be things that we need to think on. But the final point there, we also really need to capitalise and build on the authorities' work around social justice and anti-poverty that Jude Langdon and her team is leading as well. So there's a whole piece there that we've got to do to work through to make sure that our purpose is as appropriate as it can be. But that does present some opportunities. We will be able to take the opportunity to work closely with our schools and partners to understand their needs. We can really work with them to understand what we need to do to prepare for those for the coming years. We can prepare our schools to make sure that they align really clearly to the reform agenda across Wales. We can develop our anti-poverty work to maximise the impact that has on our learners and the outcomes in their work. And we can also work more broadly with our colleagues across Monmouthshire and in wider public services to develop broader interventions that will benefit Monmouthshire's children and young people. So the challenges that we now find ourselves in are equally an opportunity to step on into a different direction, one which is more attuned to the challenge that we have now. In regards to people, you'd expect that there are significant risks associated with people at the moment. I won't go through these all, but I think in general themes, clearly we are still in a global pandemic. Although the rates of infection are very low in Monmouthshire now, I think I read that it's 6 in the last fortnight, which is exceptionally positive. We haven't had any positive lateral flow test results, despite hundreds being taken by our learners over the past few weeks. But it does clearly remain a risk to our staff. We need to think about well-being. Well-being is this kind of theme that kind of comes through time and time again. We're concerned about our learners' impetus for learning. We're concerned that we're professionally able to offer the interventions that will make the biggest difference to them. There will be a huge requirement for our teachers and our school leaders to be upskilled in terms of the new reforms that are coming through. ALN is a key focus. It raises expectations on behalf of parents. It raises expectations on behalf of schools. It will change the landscape considerably. We need to think about those. And the final one, and I'm always very grateful to Sue and Beth, who lead our early years work, for reminding me, it's not all about schools, but actually our very, very youngest children born during the pandemic, there will be child development needs that need to be met as we go forward as well. And we need to think about that as a key risk for us. Again, the opportunities, and I won't go through these line by line, but I think we have got this opportunity now to play a really important role in how we make those opportunities for our people to be safe in school, but also to be ready to tackle those challenges as they come to fruition in the coming years. Our places, I guess this one is probably the one which is the easiest to kind of see. We obviously are developing the new school in Abergavenny, and in Cabinet last week it was agreed to start the consultation process around how we change the governance of the two schools involved in that development. But there are some significant challenges: the budgets and the costs, the period of time since Welsh Government agreed our strategic outline plan is significant, and we have seen inflationary pressures with regard to construction. There are challenges around statutory consultation, planning permissions, and just delays more generally. We have an issue around our specialist provision and regionally whether we've got sufficient special school places and our SNRB network in Monmouthshire. One which has come to light actually, which was really interesting, is point 3. So during the pandemic, clearly many parents were at home. And obviously, at various points in time, childcare was far more limited than it is at the moment. And we're seeing that sustainability of early year education and childcare providers has been really left in a precarious position. There was a significant loss of income for some last year, and families have changed the way that they live. And, we're working from home far more often. That means people are able to accommodate different patterns of childcare. And so our provision, which in Monmouthshire we've got a much more blended offer of maintained and non-maintained, is one that might be challenged in the coming period of time. And clearly an area again of significant conversation amongst members and this committee. We need to rapidly develop new Welsh medium provision in the northeast of the county. Our opportunities are significant though. In terms of the new school in Abergavenny, I think is a huge opportunity and a really exciting opportunity for us to think about. I think our initial engagement, I did informal briefings with all staff and all governors at both schools, and that was really positive. And I think across both schools, that opportunity to think about that new curriculum in a different setting, in an entirely different setting, is really exciting. We're seeing continued and enhanced investment in our SNRB network. I think that's really positive. And we've got our continued developments with regards to Welsh medium that I know Sharon has spoken to you about at length in the past. With regard to pedagogy, and I think pedagogy talks to everything. Everything we do has to be around, really, really strong pedagogical roots that our school leaders understand, that they adapt to their context and adapt to their community. So you can see on the left hand side there those risks, further closures, some of the challenges around parallel face-to-face and distance learning, around a very, very secure kind of position around well-being being a focus at the moment. What does that mean as we have to move away? I don't want to say move away from well-being, but we continue that kind of that movement down the continuum and focus on learning as well. And that's got to be something which we balance very carefully in the coming years. We know that the new acts are going to have a significant impact, and we're going to have to kind of continue to work through those. But the opportunity have been, and I hope they've come out clearly in the presentation this morning, have been that our schools have adapted to that change of pedagogical approach so quickly that they will really be able to kind of build on that in the future. So we'll come to conclusions now, and I hope that members of the committee feel that the report has captured the challenges of the last year. I hope equally that you think that it has done justice but not overstated the response to the efforts of our schools and the services that we have. I believe, as Chief Officer, and I guess this is my point in terms of summary, that the future of education in Monmouthshire is well placed. I'm very confident in our school leadership cadre, and I think that there's now a very clear common purpose across the system in terms of what does that recovery from the pandemic look like. I say there in that third paragraph, I don't think the future will be easy, and we can't yet really understand the full impact or quantify that impact. But I am confident in our ability to respond. We do face these kind of systemic, formalised changes in terms of the curriculum, in terms of ALN reform, but both of those have got pedagogy and well-being at their hearts. And I think in terms of that, it aligns very clearly with what we wish to achieve. I think our ambitions are undiminished. I think we continue to have the very, very highest ambition for all of our learners across Monmouthshire. And I'm confident that this huge challenge that we faced as a system has been well met, and that we're now well placed to go on and tackle the future challenges in the future. So that concludes my presentation of the report. As ever at this point in the year, I've probably spoken for far too long, but I'd be more than happy now, Chair, to stop and to take questions.
Okay. Right. Well, thanks, Will, for obviously a very comprehensive report on, as you've outlined, an incredibly challenging year for staff in schools, for your staff, for pupils, particularly for teachers who've had to adapt so quickly to a totally different form of learning. And particularly, I think of probably people who are, say, further on in their teaching career, having to switch from physically teaching. Young teachers are probably far more digitally aware than probably some of the older colleagues. But I think you've taken us through now, and I think we've clear what has happened and what is going to happen. I'm going to move. Thanks for that, and thanks for the presentation. I'm going to move now to questions and comments from members, and I go first to Councillor Martin Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Councillor Martin Grocott. I'm the Councillor for Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny and a member of the Children and Young People Committee. A few points, Will, but before that, heartfelt thanks and also congratulations to all members of your team who have worked under the most incredibly challenging circumstances and have done a fantastic job. And as I say, heartfelt thanks for that. But a few points from your report, some quite general in a sense, but I would appreciate your views, and then a couple that are perhaps a little more specific. But firstly, I am concerned really about the continuing complex needs of some of our young people and the way in which we collaborate with an Iron Bevan Health Board. And in your report on page 13, you comment that there is still a need for more formal and face-to-face relationships with health services, particularly in relation to children with more complex needs. My concern arising from newspaper and TV news report in recent days is that the health service is likely to be overwhelmed by continuing wider medical demands following the pandemic, because they have got such a huge catch up to do. And that services in health will be stretched potentially beyond breaking point. Now, I am anxious that if we are already not meeting with these people as effectively as we could be, how can you help to guarantee us that links with our colleagues in health will be as supportive as we need them to be in dealing with those youngsters with those more profound level of disabilities? Secondly, and again, around the challenging needs of some of our young people getting back into school. It will not be easy for some young people, particularly those who perhaps don't have the highest level of discipline within their own home backgrounds, and who have been out of school now for a long period, and will find it, I suspect, quite difficult to get back into that more formal type of learning within schools. Since I've been a member of this council, one recurring issue has been the high level of fixed term exclusion. And I'm anxious that schools will need support in some cases where youngsters are coming back into school and their behaviour will be extremely challenging. We just last year in your report seemed to be getting to grips with this high level of fixed term exclusion. What can you tell us about how your team will be supporting schools to help them to avoid those numbers of excluded children rising, as they will undoubtedly face some very challenging behaviour in school? Another quite general point is really, have you started the process yet of trying to capture some of the brilliant new practice that has emerged that might well continue to be very, very useful into the future? Or is the intention that we simply go back to where we were before? And if you like, that's a cricket ball I'm tossing up to you to hit to the boundary for 6. Could I also ask you about the Compass for Life? I think that the guy who you were talking about when you were outlining that was the guy I heard speak at this year's conference for school governors a few weeks ago. Really very interesting. But again, this is a bit of a heads up to you, I guess, because I'm anxious about the future of the Inspire programme that Louise Wills heads up for us in county. And she did a presentation for members recently as part of a Mon Life presentation. And she talked about the Inspire for Life, and the second one is Inspire for Work. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But I've asked a question at County Council to Councillor Greenland, but he may discuss this with you or others. It should have gone to the County Council that's just been called off, but it will now go to the next one. And talking to officers who run that's the Inspire programme, the funding will end, and it comes from the EU and then matched by the County Council. And there is concern that we will lose the expertise of those officers who are doing a great job in our comps for young people who are facing considerable challenges in leaving school and going on to worthwhile lives after that. The Compass for Life scheme sounds great, but is there overlap there with the Inspire programme? And can you at this point give us any idea of whether the Inspire programme is likely to be supported going into the future. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Well,
super. Thank you, Councillor Groker. And firstly, thank you for your comments about the way the team have worked over the last year. Really appreciate that, and I'll make sure that's passed back to them. Yeah, I think that your first point around Aneurin and Bevan, how we work with the health board and so on, is really important. We have had a recent head teacher session, actually, and we were joined by Dave Williams, who is Aneurin and Bevan's DECLO, which is the dedicated lead for relationships with education and so on under the new ALN Act. Dave's also, I think Dave's retired from one role, but certainly he was the most senior paediatric psychiatrist in Aneurin and Bevan as well. So, but Dave came to talk about that specifically, about how can we enhance and improve the relationships to make sure that we're meeting all of those expectations under the new Act. So I do absolutely have that sense that Aneurin and Bevan want to work differently with us. I absolutely concur in terms of the pressures that the NHS are likely to see. I think we saw last week, didn't we, 4.7 million operations which we're waiting for. I think the points, and I perhaps need to be more explicit in the presentation, I think it's around things like being very clear around our expectations around therapies and so on for children and young people, how they access them from their SNRB base, our expectations around frequency and so on, attendance, those type of things. It's at that level that we're really keen to work through the with Aneurin and Bevan. And Jackie Elias, who many of you will know, has presented at this panel previously, is working very closely with them around a new and revised kind of memorandum of understanding, I guess, between ourselves and the health board to make sure that we capture that. So I think that's a very fair point in terms of the complex needs there. Yeah, in terms of your second point and in terms of behaviour, speaking to some head teachers, we are seeing that already, that actually the change going back from this kind of very different year we've had into a very kind of formalised setting is challenging for some of our children and young people, and we're already picking up some reports around challenging behaviours, exactly as you set out. I think we've recently started a piece of work across our traditional kind of inclusion services, our educational psychology team and our ALN team to really work through a very clear process for our schools to understand the pathway when children are identified with behaviour that is challenging. You know, what's the root cause of that behaviour and how can we help those children at that root cause? And one of the pieces, I think, which I alluded to in the presentation around that, you know, those emotionally based school avoidance, you know, there will be emotionally based behaviours as well. So actually kind of framing it in that sense is one of the things which we're doing at the moment and working kind of across teams and CYP to achieve that. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And in terms of your third question around the some of the changes have been absolutely incredible. Some of the ways in which our schools have thought about things differently in the year are absolutely things that they will look to continue. I think the way that they've adapted and changed their curriculums, the way that they have adapted and changed the way they deliver to groups, their use of space, their recognition of the outside, all of those are kind of right up there in terms of the things which we know that those school leaders want to carry on in the future. I think in some regards, it's been an interesting kind of point in time. So obviously we were in a process whereby we knew the new curriculum was coming. We've had the curriculum disapplied during the period of the pandemic so that schools could meet their learners' needs as locally determined. That actually allows them now to move very easily into, well, not very easily, perhaps that's me overstating that, but as for a smooth transition from current delivery into the new curriculum delivery into the future. And I know many members are on Twitter and so on, and if you just follow a selection of our primary schools and secondary schools, you will see just the range of activities, the range of the ways they're working, many of them adapting to the full purposes of the new curriculum already. I think there's a huge amount that they'll take positively into the future. And I think some of the things which have changed, I think will, in the broader sense, I think one of the things which many schools have talked about are virtual parents' evenings. I think the days of queuing up, waiting to see your children's teachers and then sitting on a chair that is frankly far too small for you might well be in the past, and I think virtual parents' evenings will be retained now into the future. I think they seem to have worked very well according to many of our schools. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount of good, and we'll be working really closely with our colleagues in the AS to capture that. In terms of the Compass for Life, yeah, you're absolutely right. Floyd is doing work with EAS at the moment, so I think he did present to the governor's summit or conference. I'm glad you thought it was a worthwhile engagement. I think that sounds really positive. Yes, there's a clear link, I think, between the work on the Compass for Life and the work in the Inspire programmes. One of the things we'll be doing is getting Floyd together with those teams. It was one of the things which was on the planner but did get impacted by the pandemic. But now as we come back out of the pandemic, that's something which we want to work together on, because there can be a continuum then. One of the things which we're hopeful for is for the Compass for Life is that engagement in years 5 and 6 allows for that impetus to be carried through into secondary school. And if that means that some of those learners who work with the Inspire to Achieve group actually have got a language and a means by which they can articulate what they want to achieve to those professionals they work with at a secondary school, I think that's a huge benefit. So that's certainly a mainstay. I'm afraid I haven't got any news today in terms of future funding, but I know that how positively and how well regarded those interventions are held by our 4 secondary schools. So we will look to support that in any way we can. And I think it's also worthwhile just noting as well that I think at your last full council meeting, the chief executive took a paper about some slight tweaks to the senior leadership team. One of which is that as Chief Officer for Children and Young People, I'll have probably a closer kind of commissioning and directional role with regard to some of the youth services than we've had to this point in time. So I'm really looking forward to working very closely with my colleagues in Mon Life, so we can really make sure that what we understand and what we learn from schools and so on can be enacted upon by those groups. So I hope I've answered all of your questions, Councillor Croker, but thank you for those.
Okay, thanks, Will. We move now to Councillor Lisa Dimmick, please, with her hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I don't think we can congratulate you and thank you and your team enough for the magnificent work that they've done during the pandemic. You know, you've adapted so quickly during challenging times. I think Councillor Grocott made some valid points there, especially about the wellbeing and Iron Bevan. But I was wondering about the ongoing support for teachers. Obviously, you mentioned this retired school teacher who is being used as a soundboard. You know, we're not out of this yet, and obviously teachers, headmistresses and headmasters are going to face some really challenging times getting children back into the routine of school. The kids that were flourishing before may have taken a step back. Some might not want to come back to school. We've got all sorts of anxiety. How are we going to support them as best we can to, one, recognise those that have taken a step back, and just how they're going to adapt to teaching. I love the idea of the remote parents' evening. I think that's great. Obviously, we've also got parents that would have lost jobs. We're dealing with parents with mental health issues. This is going to impact on children. So it's how can we best support teachers going forward now and recognising those problems.
Thanks, Councillor Dimmick. I think they're, a series of, you've summed up probably the kind of one of the core challenges that we face. I think this, and again, it's this, schools at the moment having the time to understand the scale of the challenge that they will face, I think is really important. And as I said, we've, in response to Councillor Grocott, we know that some of the behaviours aren't where we want them to be in terms of creating a really positive learning environment for all learners. I think what we've got to do is we need to continue to be very supportive. We need to continue to make sure that our interventions are proportionate and measured, and we don't suddenly step back into kind of undue expectations around schools in terms of what they provide us and so on. We've got to make sure that, that what schools do, working with the local authority, really adds value to the work that they're doing. And so if that means just simply sharing with us plans rather than doing additional plans, we will do all of those things. I think I say in the report, just to try and lift that burden off schools so that they've got their time and their energy to really invest in their learners, which is what they always do, but also to make sure that, with the resource that they now have, that they can make those investments that will make things better for their children and young people. I think your point around how family dynamics might have changed in the pandemic, we will see kind of work through, I think, in the coming months. I think listening to the news today, they were talking about unemployment rates, particularly being difficult for younger people. I think the under 35s are the most significantly impacted in terms of unemployment. But then also this point around as the economy opens back up over time, there's a potential kind of opportunities there in terms of how we might think supporting our young people into work in that way. So I think that it's got to be our key focus. It's, I think, about an approach rather than about specific things. I'll say we will do this, but it's really got to be the piece which we say to our schools, this is still the most important thing. The well-being doesn't go away. It isn't suddenly back to making sure that we get the maximum number of examination outcomes. That will always be important, and our schools will always want to achieve that. But actually supporting those children who might be anxious, supporting those children to flourish again, as you said, in school is going to be critical. But I'm really looking forward to one of the team, Becky's been putting a series of different opportunities for me to go and visit a whole range of schools in the coming weeks. And I can't wait to actually just go out and see how the children and young people have responded, to see what they're doing. I mean, the visits I did before Christmas, before we went into the last lockdown, they were amazing to see how the schools had adapted in that autumn term. So I fully expect to see that continued. But I think you're really, really core points there. We have to continue to do all we can to make sure that schools can focus on what's really important.
Okay, thank you, Will. With regards to this retired soundboard, is there any scope to keep that in place for a period of yeah. Okay, and I don't know about you, Chair, but I'd love to hear Will's sort of review after he's gone out to the schools and visited to see how the children are doing and teachers. That'd be great. Thank you so much, Will, and thank your team as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Dimmick. I think that's a good suggestion. We'd certainly, have Will back, with an update. Go now to Councillor Maureen Powell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Maureen Powell. I'm Councillor for Castle Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee. Thank you so much, Will, for such a comprehensive report. You've all must have worked very, very hard, and it's almost like you've written a novel, and it takes a lot for getting in. Just a couple of points. One is that there has been a number of pupils who, normally speaking, would fool about in class and not concentrate and be a bit of troublesome. But I have been told that since they've been isolated at home, they've actually started to turn around and learn and take an interest and do some really good work. Now, it'll be interesting to see when they come back now, whether they're still in the mindset for working, having got into the habit of working, that it might make a difference to them. So I think there's going to be changes all around. And the other thing, there's always a problem about the number of exclusions from schools. But if you look into it in detail, very often it's not that many children that's excluded. It's just that there's a few that are always having a lot of exclusion. So I think figures sometimes can be confusing, and it mightn't be that the number of children is as bad as it may seem. And also there are some children who are going to be really thankful to be back at school, because some of them, unfortunately and sadly, are living in disruptive homes, and probably where father or mother have lost their jobs, and things are difficult at home enough without that. And we don't know really how some of these children do have have lived through this, but to have lived through that in isolation must have been dreadful. And I should think some of them will be really thankful and relieved to be back at school and in a routine that they're used to. But you know, they're not so much questions as details that I think will, you know, hopefully will come out of it. I'm sure that there's going to be, by the end of a term of reintroducing school again, there's going to be a lot of changes from a lot of children, and I wonder whether you feel this as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Powell. Just to pick up on a couple of those, I think we've certainly already seen that for some learners, they benefited from learning from home. You know, I've talked a little bit about the emotional-based responses to school avoidance. For children who struggled with going to school, actually the past period will have been of a significant advantage to them because they were able to learn at their pace in a place where they felt safe and secure. They might not necessarily always feel safe and secure in schools. So I think that's really interesting in terms of, and I think we need to be very careful that we don't just kind of say categorically it's better for everybody now back in school. And actually, I think in our EOTIS, which is our education other than at school provision, I think we're now seeing the benefits of our blended learning model of being able to do some synchronous, some asynchronous learning, some face-to-face. I think that we will see that develop over time, and I think that will be really positive. So I think absolutely some learners will have made progress during that period of time who will have learnt in a different way at home, and I think that's positive. In terms of our exclusions, I think the work by Richard Austin and his colleagues, we always try and, well, we do always record the number of incidents, the number of episodes, the lengths of the exclusions, the number of children affected and so on. So we capture that information at that level. And you're right, sometimes that there are concentrations amongst a very small number of pupils. But equally, going back to Councillor Grocut's points, we have over the past few years seen rates of fixed term exclusion, which I would say are too high in some of our schools. So I think between you both, I think we've got an accurate position. And I think that I think your final point is very much aligned to Councillor Dimmick's, that point around, you know, it's really positive for us to have have eyes on our learners. I think that was our biggest concern during the pandemic, was that for those children who we thought might be vulnerable, we wouldn't see them every day. We wouldn't see how they were doing. We wouldn't be able to engage them in the same way we had. Now, schools put a huge amount of effort into telephone calls, engagement, video calls, all of those kind of things to make sure that they did have a sense about where their children, young people were. But actually, it's only now when you see the children come back that you'll be able to really understand that impact. But we're at the very early stages of that. Children are still used to probably being back in school. So we'll see now over the coming weeks and this term, you know, how our schools feel. But as I said, I'd be more than happy to come back to Select and talk about what it's been like as I've been out and seen the schools and hopefully spoken to some of the children as well.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks. Thank you, Councillor Maureen Powell and Will, for the response. Councillor Louise Brown now, please.
Good morning, Councillor Louise Brown, Vice Chair of the Committee and Member for Shire Newton Ward. I wanted to reiterate what's been said with regard to, you know, the thanks to school staff and local authority staff in coping with this pandemic, which has obviously been very challenging. It's been challenging in education and virtually across the board. I mean, in terms of the NHS, for example, they're going to have a huge catch up with a backlog of operations that they haven't been able to do because of COVID. And in many senses, your report, in some senses, says the same sort of thing, that, you know, the negative impact with regard to disadvantaged learners, and it's going to be a very challenging sort of catch-up time. Not only for disadvantaged learners, but for mental health issues and so forth, and the adaptation of going back to school and everything else on top of that. Do you think, in terms of supporting teachers and supporting pupils, that what's been talked about on a national basis about postponing the new curriculum would be a good idea when there's so much challenge going on, getting everybody back into school and helping to catch up, because to put the pressure of a new curriculum on top, and I know sort of from being on the SACRI thing that things on that area are certainly not well prepared, and I appreciate that heads might give a different view to how teachers find all of the challenges that are going on at the moment. So that's one question. The second question that I've got is about the Compass for Life, which I think sounds a very good idea to me, you know, to motivate pupils in their vision of what they would like to do. But I would also like to see whether or not this is sort of tailored towards a type of career guidance, because in some senses, if a pupil says, I want to be a vet, then, you know, in a sense, it will be helpful if sort of caring for animals and different occupations associated with that could be considered. And the same way that a pupil might say, I want to be a doctor, well, you know, looking at nursing or even care staff and caring professions in general, because, you know, the difficulty is if a too high a goal is set in terms of academic achievement, because obviously for you know, medical and veterinary practice, you need to have very high A levels and so forth to be able to get into school, and you want this to inspire them, but not to discourage them if they find that they can't, you know, reach this particular level of achievement. And I think in some senses linking in with the social services and our care staff, because in Wales there's a great demand for you know, well, there is across the UK, because obviously because of the population becoming in general more elderly. Third question I've got really is focusing on your report with regard to vulnerable learners. I think there's a table there that said, I think you identified 85 vulnerable learners. Now I'm not quite sure, because there was previous figures in the report about number of vulnerable learners, and I'm not sure where the 85 comes from, but it then was separated out into the different hubs, and some of them seem to have a big difference in terms of the refusals, and I just wondered what happened to them. I mean, I know you said some did for medical reasons, but if you look at the table, there's some, you know, quite differences whereby one school had virtually everybody accepting and another school only say 50%. This is just from memory, I haven't got the table in front of me, but you know, obviously there was a significant difference, and I think there was about 22, about sort of 30% that didn't. So I think it was a question of what happened to those particular, because the ones that accept them you're less concerned about because they're getting the education that or the support that they need, but it's those that are sort of saying no. I hope that's not too many questions, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Councillor.
That's fine, no problems at all. So I think it's a really interesting question about the how we launch the new curriculum. I think obviously it's been enacted and the curriculum for Wales has been passed into law now. I think there will be significant change with regard to education leadership in Welsh Government post the election. So we know obviously that the current minister isn't standing, so I'm not saying anything. So it won't be Kirsty Williams as the cabinet member next time. We know that. We know that there will be a new director for education in Wales. That post has recently been advertised. So there'll be significant change in terms of the political and civil service leadership. I think it's going to be a really kind of fine balance And it's interesting actually, because one of the things that Councillor Thomas said in his, I think, opening comments to the questions was about how some teachers might have struggled to adapt to digital learning. I think there's an interesting kind of parallel really, because there might have been teachers who are younger who have got more experience around digital learning, but some of our older or more experienced teachers have worked when they haven't had a national curriculum, and that in essence is the position we're moving back to, because we're moving back to a curriculum that will be designed and created at a school level. So actually some of those experienced teachers will be invaluable in actually helping support the younger members of staff actually develop that. And so between the two facets, actually that should leave us in a really strong position. I don't think I would offer a definitive view about whether the curriculum should be postponed. I think that the setting aside of the curriculum over the past year, seeing schools develop their practice, actually does, as I said, kind of almost lend itself to a transitionary position into the new curriculum. But you know, as I say, it's been passed into law, so I think we remain, until we're told another way, that committed to enacting that curriculum along the existing timelines. Yeah, the Compass for Life, I think what is really important is about not placing, not giving children a perspective that very early on in their lives that they might not be able to do something. I think what's hugely important is that children are able to articulate what they're interested in and what their aspirations are. And I think the point of the Compass, and Councillor Grocott will have heard some of this, is that, you know, the four cardinals need to be kept in balance. So once a child is able to articulate what they'd like to do, they then have to work through that process of understanding the steps they need to get there. So if it was to be a medic, say, as a pretty high level example, you know, they would have to then be thinking about, you know, what they have to do, what they need to achieve in school, the subjects they need to study, the work experiences they need to try and achieve, who they need to talk to. And then the East and the West, kind of provide this kind of my value set that guides me through that journey. And the kind of the warrior piece, the Western Cardinal, is the bit which is about your own resilience to keep going in search of that. And I suspect someone whose career I think has probably meandered as much as the map on the slide that I showed earlier, I think there are points in time when you don't necessarily reach the goal that you'd set yourself, but then you have to learn, and part of your adaptation and resilience is changing that. And that's very much what we're talking to the children and young people about. And with regards to your question about the 85, I have got the detailed answer on that, which I will share with you, Councillor Brown. I just don't want to try and read it at the same time as talking to the committee. So I can share that with all members of the committee through Hazel afterwards as to why some of those children didn't take up their places. But I know that those that didn't continue to be in significant contact with their schools. Both school and social services colleagues continue to engage with all of the children to make sure that they were being supported effectively.
Okay, thank you, Will. We'll go now to
Thank you.
Peter Strong.
Hi, Peter Strong, a co-opted member from the National Education Union. Two questions, and I'd like to take them one at a time if I can. First of all, Will, you mentioned centre-determined grades for GCSEs and A-levels, pointing out quite rightly that the system this year should be a vast improvement on the chaotic situation that you described last year. But you also pointed out that the new arrangements this year are a huge burden on teachers in secondary schools. I'd just really like, I mean, just to explain that, I mean, in the past, when people took their GCSE and A-level exams, off went the exam papers, would be marked by separately employed examiners who weren't employed by the schools. and so all that will be done elsewhere. Now teachers are having to do the marking and the moderation, and the moderation in particular is a extremely time-consuming process, and it is of course crucial that they get it right. Yeah. So I would like to ask what arrangements, if anything, are being made, particularly financial arrangements, to allow, where necessary, teachers to have time off a timetable to do that necessary or shoulder that necessary huge burden.
Thanks, Peter. And I know one of the things I didn't actually put in the presentation in terms of collaboration that was remiss of me was that throughout the last year we've had a very, very frequent engagement with our colleagues in the trade unions, and that's across the NAHT, the Association of School and College Leaders, the NEU, NASUWT, the Welsh Language Union, and Unison and GMB. Well, yeah, Unison and GMB. So we've met on a weekly basis at the height of the pandemic, and more recently we've stepped that down to a fortnightly meeting, and we're due to meet tomorrow. And Centre Determined Grades work focuses on the agenda tomorrow for our discussion. And I've been just want to put on the record from my perspective how grateful I've been for the way in which our union colleagues have worked with us over the past year. I think they brought genuine concerns to that meeting, but have worked really purposefully to resolve any concerns that we've had. And I think it's been a really positive engagement between ourselves. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of trying to support schools, so the Welsh Government, it's a difficult situation because typically the relationship is between the examination centre, which is the school, and the examination board, and not the local authority. So local authorities do not have a direct relationship with in that engagement between the centre and the board. And so this year, the work that has been done to establish how centre determined grades will be established and ascertained has been done through a group called the Design and Delivery Group, which is a group brought together by the Minister, which has had advisory members from Quals Wales and from the WJEC. And they have worked through this process by which we've ended up at centre determined grades. The Welsh Government has looked and has said that I think that one of the inset days this year can be turned over to use to prepare for centre determined grades. But as a couple of my head teachers have pointed out, actually, those inset days were to prepare for new curriculum and other developments. So actually, those are really important. So you've got to be careful about that balance. It is an area which head teachers are talking to me about frequently in terms of the weight of work that is likely to fall onto schools this year, and also post-awarding of results, that there's a different dynamic this year with regard to appeals and so on, which will focus at school level. So, Peter, it's a conversation which we continue to be involved with. I've had another briefing note come through today from Quals Wales and WJEC. I know one of our schools has worked with Mon Life, so they are providing some clap timetable time for other year groups, so that teachers have got time to work on the centre determined grade process. I don't think there's a magic bullet that we have in terms of the local authority, but it is an issue that we're very aware of. I'm working with the schools and at a national ADU, the Association of Directors of Education in Wales level, to try and resolve and provide additional support to schools for.
Okay, thank you very much for that. As you say, no doubt that will come up in the meeting tomorrow with the trade union reps, and we have to drill down into that with them. So thank you. But my second point was about the figures on page 19 that you didn't want to dwell on for obvious reasons. But there was one particular standout figure, and that was the free school meals resorts from school 3. Yeah. Certainly on the face of it, something to be massively celebrated. So I was just wondering what plans you have for drilling down into those resorts, looking at what lies behind them, and determining what what can be shared from those results, obviously with other schools, other secondary schools particularly, but also with this committee.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And yeah, no, exactly. It is, you know, I didn't want to dwell on it, but I have circled it. It's an outstanding result in that school that year. We always look to make sure that we capture the very best and to make sure that other schools are aware of that. And equally, I know our colleagues in the AS will be looking to identify that good practice. Sometimes, given the number of pupils, we can have quite small cohorts, so you can have volatility. So, what one year you might have, legitimately an outstanding cohort of learners who are entitled to free school meals, and other years it might not be the same. And I know in this report previously, I've looked at in great detail the actual cohort and any other additional challenges and additional learning needs they might have as well. So we'll continue to do that and work with the schools to understand that. And of course, we do share that good practice whenever we can.
Okay, thank you. It'd be very interesting to look at the same school's figures next year and the year after to see if they've been maintained, of course. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Peter, for that. And thanks, Will, for the response. I mean, that came up in the pre-meeting. It is quite stark, you know, in terms of that unidentified school. Members, are there any other questions or issues? I don't see any hands up at the moment. No. Well, once again, obviously, I'd like to thank Will for coming to Scrutiny Committee this morning, giving us such a comprehensive report. I'd reiterate the thanks as well to his staff, but also teachers, support staff, cleaners, caretakers, etc. All the staff who have really pulled out every stop in the most difficult situation that anybody has ever experienced, and hopefully ever will experience. You know, my wish is that the pandemic will not sort of re-spike now in the autumn. We're in a relatively calm period now, but on the other hand, we were in a calm period this time last year. But then we went into a very dire winter in terms of hospital admissions, etc. So, you know, thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr for that. Really welcome the comments by Councillor Grocott about linking with Aneurin Bevan, the challenges of getting children back into school, the issue of fixed term exclusion. In reality, personally, I would not want to see children excluded without need now, because they have been excluded for a long period of time because of COVID, and as much as possible they need to be there. And also this issue of capture of good practice, we don't want to lose that. In terms of Compass for Life, again, I very much support that, which was raised by Councillor Grocott, and other issues brought by Lisa Dimmick. Ongoing support for teachers, it's going to be ongoing. It hasn't stopped, has it? And there's a huge amount of catch-up to do. And certainly in terms of points that Councillor Louise Brown made about this catch-up after COVID, I think that is something that we will look at in the future. It still concerns the committee, and it certainly concerns me in terms of children who are in more challenging circumstances, both financially and in other respects. And certainly thinking of those children, then I think we must focus our help on assisting them to get back to where they should be, because you know, it's been so disruptive. It's been incredibly disruptive. And certainly I think the Compass for Life, I think for some children, we're fortunate who have very aspirational parents, and parents who might be in jobs such as veterinary science or medicine. You know, they have that insight, which some children don't have if their parents are not in that sort of role. And I think anything we can do to assist them, and certainly my thought when I was teaching a long time ago was to be aspirational for my pupils and to encourage them to look as wide as possible. And as you say, perhaps that might not come to fruition, but then there is always plan B. And I'm sure more, you know, lots of people, myself included, have gone to plan B when plan A doesn't perhaps come about, for whatever reason. But again, I won't go on and on, but you know, once again, thanks to all your staff. We really do appreciate it. And more importantly, I know parents have appreciated it, and certainly parents in my ward and where I live have expressed that about a number of schools. So I think that is very much to the credit of schools and you know, of your department. So once again, diolch yn fawr. Thank you, Will.
Excellent, thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll move on now then in terms of the agenda, and we're going to look now at the next item on the agenda, which is, waiting for it to come up, is to look at the CYP Select Forward Work Plan. And certainly from discussion at the pre-meeting this morning, the key things that we want to focus on in the future, free school meals, probably asking Sharon Randall-Smith from the CYP department to come back to update us on that. Young carers, we want to refocus our thoughts on them, and thanks. And also we want to set up a subcommittee to support the youth services. Youth services came in last time with Josh Klein and Jade, who spoke to us. So I'd want some volunteers for that. I know that Lisa has already volunteered. I would be happy to go on that subgroup. I don't know if anybody else would feel happy to come on to a youth subgroup. If you want to email Hazel or myself, but primarily Hazel, and perhaps copy me in. And then the other issue then is to look at being updated on the new curriculum, and obviously that was up for discussion this morning. It's a huge sea change for primary and secondary schools, and obviously coming at quite a difficult time, and certainly there's some strong union thoughts on that. But apart from that, I think we as a committee need to be updated about the new curriculum. Is there anything I've missed there? Would any member want to add anything in there? No. In terms of...
Sorry, yes.
Yes, Councillor Brown.
Sorry, can we add about, on the update of the curriculum, about the need to catch up because of COVID, and about this idea whether or not there should be some postponement? I think I'd like to add that within it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Brown. That's a good suggestion. Anything else? Peter, do you want to come in, or you just, is that an old hand? I think it's an old hand. Okay, thanks. Agenda item 6, the Cabinet and Council Work Planner. We just have that presented. We accept that. And then 7, to confirm the minutes of our previous meeting. Would somebody move on that we pass that, or are there any issues on that?
Yes, I'm with that,
I'll move them, Chair.
Okay, okay. So we're happy with those.
I'll second that.
And then, thank you, Councillor Powell. And then lastly, to confirm the date and time of the next meeting of CYP as being the 27th of May, 2021. So that concludes the meeting. Thanks for your time this morning, and thanks for your very positive and interesting questions and observations. It's certainly, CYP is always a lively, productive meeting, and really that's what scrutiny meetings should be. So other than that, express my thanks. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr am bore yma. Thank you for this morning, and I hope you have a fairly pleasant sunny day if you're not dashing off to another meeting.
Bye.
Well, thank you, Chair. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.